The study was done by Michael Kimmel, who you may know because he is a fairly well-known sociologist, and he gets invited to speak all around the world. And so he came up with this clever experiment where he asked young men two questions. First, he would ask them, what does it mean to be a good man? If you're at a funeral and in the eulogy somebody says he was a good man, what does that mean? And Michael Kimmel says, all around the globe, young men had no trouble answering that. Immediately, they would say things like honor, duty, sacrifice, integrity, do the right thing, look out for the little guy, be a protector, be a provider, be responsible. And he would ask them, where'd you learn that? And they would say, well, I don't know, it's just in the air we breathe. Or if they were from a Western country, they would often say something like, it's part of our Judeo-Christian heritage. Michael Kimmel has a Jewish background, so maybe that's why he picked up on that. And then he would ask a follow-up question, though. He would ask, what does it mean if I say to you, man up, be a real man? And the young man would say, oh no, that's completely different. That means be tough, be strong, never show weakness, win at all costs, suck it up. What else? Be competitive, get rich, get laid. I'm using their language. And so the sociologist concludes that men are sort of caught between these two competing scripts, that universally, men seem to have an inherent, innate sense of what it means to be a good man. It's not from any particular part of the world. It's universal. From Brazil to Sweden to Australia, you got the same answers. It seems to be an innate knowledge. I would say because men are made in God's image, they do know what it means to be the good man. But they also feel this cultural pressure to live up to the real man's, quote unquote, which involves traits that we probably do consider more toxic, especially when decoupled from a moral ideal. It can slide into entitlement and control and dominance and so on. And so I kind of used this as a connecting thread for the whole book, which was, what is the good man? How do we know it? But how has the real man gained more and more power in our culture, to the point where we now have the Andrew Tate phenomenon, the idea that the real man is defined by fast money, fast cars, and fast women. So I wanted to sort of explain the development of the real man, because I think it's kind of what we're up against now. And it also, I think it gives us a different way to approach these issues. Instead of accusing men of being toxic, most men don't respond very well to that, surprisingly. What we should try to do is to tap into their innate, inherent knowledge of what it means to be the good man. I think most men aspire, really, to be the good man. One of my favorite psychotherapists is Terry Real, and he talks about this in his counseling. He counsels severely troubled marriages. And what he says is, I make an alliance with the good man part. He uses that language even. I make an alliance with the good man and get his help in working against, sort of the negative traits that he is maybe enacting in his marriage. So it's even it's something that I think even psychotherapists might be able to use. How do we tap into the good man? There's even a book called When Good Men Behave Badly. When good men behave badly. So being able to approach man with the understanding that, in their heart of hearts, they do aspire to be the good man, I think gives us a much more positive approach to these issues.
So Sean and I are here. We're brothers. Obviously both men, but also raising sons. And it's an interesting, Sean and I we're having the conversation about his son who is 3 years old. Mm-hmm. And when we talk about testosterone, right, and the natural inclinations of some boys to be aggressive and to be competitive, and there's always this, I think, challenge when you're trying to raise a son, because that there are certain values around protection and standing up for those who might need to be protected, and being able to be a man of honor and integrity. And sometimes that often comes with your own personal kind of challenges with fear. And when you do raise a child in a godly home or religious home, in you do speak to that concept of love that you so beautifully spoke about earlier. Like a love is, it's an action, and it's an energy, and it's a respect for others, and doing those right things are always around greater concepts of that we are all kind of connected. So it's how we raise our kids is really critically important in today's secular society, especially with exposure to popular media, social media, the things that you were speaking about, Andrew Tate, materialism, viewing your value as a man as someone to be able to conquer and to make as much money and have as many women as you can. How much, as American society grows more secular, how does secularization kind of contribute to this negative script for masculinity? And then how are we as fathers, how can we really protect our sons from this?
Yeah, by the way, I just saw a terrible image. It was a news tabloid from Australia, and the cover image showed a boy about 7 years old, he looked like. And the title, this big headline was, "How do we prevent this boy from becoming a monster?" What? And then underneath it talked about how parents need to address this menace. What kind of ideology teaches parents that their little boys can become monsters and that they are potential menaces? I thought that was one of the worst examples of toxic masculinity I've ever seen, of charging boys with toxic masculinity. Anyway, yeah, through the book, I do go through several stages of how our culture became more secular in its view of masculinity. And why don't I just start with, sort of the big picture? It goes back to, many people think, it goes back to maybe the 1960s, second wave feminism. But no. It goes much further back. It goes back to the Industrial Revolution. Because before that, men are working alongside their wives and children on the family farm, the family industry, the family business. And so the cultural expectation for men focused very much on their caretaking role, on their responsibility for their children. They had to be gentle and patient because they're working with the wives and kids all day. In fact, this was fascinating. One of the most surprising historical facts I found was that most of the literature on parenting in that day, which would be sermons, advice manuals, and so on, was addressed to fathers. If you go in a bookstore today, most of the books on parenting are addressed to mothers. But back then, fathers were considered the primary parent. And they were even called house fathers. We say housewives. They said house fathers. So they had a very much of a fathering definition of manhood. In fact, there was another phrase that was often used. Fathers were also expected to be, quote, fathers of the community. In other words, they were supposed to bring that fathering ethos out into the community in the way they interacted with other people. And again, a caretaking role. How did we lose that very rich understanding of masculinity and masculine virtue? So the Industrial Revolution took work out of the home. Men, of course, had to follow their work out of the home into factories and offices. And for the first time in American history, they were not working with their families, with people they loved and had a moral bond with. They were working as individuals in competition with other men. And that's when you first start to see the language change. The literature of the day began to protest. They didn't like it. They began to protest that men were losing that caretaking ethos. They were becoming egocentric, individualistic, self-centered, greedy and acquisitive, making an idol out of their career, and so on. I'm giving you some of the language of that day. So this is really when you start to see the shift. The first time you really see negative language applied to the male character was already in the 19th century, which of course does give us some sense of how we need to respond to it. Can we reconnect men to their families? And you asked about the secular script. So the secularization was also happening at this time, because through the Industrial Revolution, there emerged a very large public square, right, with factories and businesses and financial institutions and universities and the state. And people began to argue that these large public institutions should operate by scientific principles, by which they primarily meant value-free. In other words, don't bring your private values into the public realm, which is what we still hear today. And since it was men who were getting that secular university education, working in that secular field, that secular work environment, already in the literature today, people began to complain that men were becoming more secular. They were not going to churches often. They were not governing their behavior by a biblical ethic. 19th century is known for having a huge rise in drinking, gambling, prostitution, the whole range of sort of traditionally male vices. And that's why. So I take in the book, I go through several stages beyond that in terms of, how the secular script developed. But that's sort of the starting point. You can't really stand against a social trend unless you know where it came from. How did it start? How did it develop? So that's why I go back to the Industrial Revolution to kind of help people understand how it started.
At least in our lifetime, I have a tendency to be influenced by pop culture. So film, television, and I worked in advertising for, 15, 20 years. So I really paid attention to advertising commercials, and there's just a general portrayal of men as buffoons. And I always saw the commercial end of it as recognizing that women were primarily the primary purchaser for the home. So they wanted to represent the women in the household as the ones making the decision, almost like saving the husband from making horrible decisions. So I kind of saw the humor in it. But if you go back to film, you have like Mr. Mom, you have all these TV shows that just showed men as helpless, basically.
Homer Simpson. And
yeah, like what happened that transition from the 80s until now, that was the general path for men versus what it was in the 60s and 70s where, father knows best.
Yes, well, it's a negative view, not just of men, but particularly of fathers.